Welcome everybody to this session on innovative financing for education. It's a great honor to have you here today. My name is Lisbeth Stier. I am the Executive Director of the Global Education Commission. We are going to talk about a really important topic today. There are great ideas being discussed at this pre-summit in terms of transforming education, but none of this will happen without the necessary finance. And as we innovate in terms of delivering education, we also need to innovate when it comes to financing, because resources are very scarce. So I'm particularly honored today to have some wonderful guests as well as panelists to guide this discussion and to talk about innovation as well as a specific innovation that is proposed as a deliverable for the summit called the International Finance Facility for Education, or IFED. So if you hear the word IFED, that is what it stands for. So, first of all, it is my great honor to introduce the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, who will give some opening remarks, and she will be followed by Mr. Gordon Brown, who is the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education and the Chair of the Education Commission. The Deputy Secretary General has been a wonderful supporter of this idea, and we are incredibly honored to have her here today, especially given that you unfortunately can't be here in person, but we are so glad and grateful that you are joining us on the line. Please, Deputy Secretary General.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisbeth. It's lovely to see you there. And I also regret not being with you in the room. One thing, though, that COVID can't beat, that's technology. So really happy to be with you. Right Honourable Gordon Brown, my friend, distinguished ministers, dear friends, good morning, bonjour. As you know, I've regrettably also joined Gordon and many others on the list who really would have wanted to be nothing more than to be with you in person today. And I missed it yesterday with the youth, but this is such an important subject. But I can feel the momentum growing towards September. An enormous amount of work has been done in the clusters on the issues, and we are seeing this reverberating from the countries into our rooms today in Paris and hopefully into New York with greater clarion calls. We're moving closer to our two primary objectives: birthing a new vision for an education that is fit for the 21st century, and mobilizing a truly lasting movement that will put that vision into practice over the coming years. In a few hours, we'll begin the ministerial segment of our pre-summit, where we will have the opportunity to hear the perspectives of over 140 national governments. It's amazing, it's unprecedented, it shows the appetite for what education needs to be doing and how we need to support it. Yesterday, I heard quite a bit that reinforced the urgency for transformation. I was particularly moved by our spoken word star, and I'm sure many of you are in the room, Ayan Said, speaking at the opening of the Youth Forum. Her words about the way our education systems are excluding and failing to empower a generation of young people really hammered home the urgency of what we need to do. And part of the response to that urgency lies in examining every possible option for mobilizing more and better investments in education. And we must talk about the investment in education, because the return is multifold, not just in the person, but in economies and peace and in many, many issues that were discussed yesterday. I believe each and every one of us at this discussion is coming from the same starting point. Our first priority is to grow the volume and effectiveness of domestic resources for education, growing our economies, increasing taxes, strengthening tax systems, tackling corruption, clamping down on illicit financial flows, all of which are central to expanding the revenue base. And that's what sustainable development is about. But I'm really looking forward to the discussions in the next 2 days that will help further advance and sharpen these proposals. But proposals on domestic finance does not and cannot diminish the responsibility of the international community to support developing countries in their journey towards transformation. International financing, especially grants, but also in specific contexts, concessional loans, can and must play a bigger role. I therefore welcome today the discussion on the International Finance Facility for Education, IFED. We know that the challenges in education in lower middle income countries are huge. And we also know that as needs grow in these countries, budgets are falling, both national and international. So this is a crisis, a truly human one, that is undermining our ability to solve and prevent a myriad of other crises. But herein also lies the opportunity. Every dark cloud has a silver lining. And if we succeed in transforming education, particularly in these countries, we can lay a path for a much wider transformation of our world. Not going to be easy, but it will certainly not happen without more and better financing of education from all sources. I therefore reiterate the Secretary General's call to help operationalize IFED in the context of the summit. And I urge public and philanthropic donors and multilateral development banks to join in this effort. With the availability of ODA for education constrained due to the impacts of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, it is more important than ever that scarce resources be leveraged. And this is precisely the innovative offer that IFED provides. As you discuss this initiative in further detail today, I'd like to urge all of us to work through the different steps that can be taken to ensure that the facility emerges in a manner that is fully complementary to and coherent with our other sources of international financing for education. It's done in tandem with a growth in overseas development assistance dedicated to education, and it gets fully behind a national vision for education transformation. Right Honourable Gordon Brown, Excellencies, there is no doubt that our world is in a difficult place. And there are plenty of things we can do together to move us forward, but we need to have the political and the partnership will to make sure that we're doing things differently if we want a better future. Ending the learning crisis, driving education transformation is one foundational step we can take, making sure that all sources of finance, particularly for middle-income, low-income countries, are taken advantage of. IFED is one tool that can support this effort. So I encourage all of us to focus today on how best to get this initiative off the ground, and more importantly, in more concrete terms, leveraging the additional resources it generates to end the learning crisis, drive the education transformation that our world so desperately needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these incredibly encouraging words. We have our marching orders for September. Thank you very much. So now I would like to turn to Right Honourable Gordon Brown, global leader on education and many other things, as you know, also the chair of the Education Commission. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to follow Amina Mohammed, and I hope she will quickly recover from COVID, but it's a measure of her commitment to education and what we're trying to do that she is speaking to us today, even when suffering from COVID. No one has done more to alert us to the need for financing and improving education than Amina, and her work is known not just in this continent, but in every continent of the world. I also want to thank all of you who've attended today at this very early session. We have attendance from many, many countries, low income, middle income, donor countries, and we have the attendance of the Asian Development Bank in particular, which is pursuing this idea with great detail. And we also have attendance from foundations, and I'm very grateful to them for the support they're giving at the moment. And I want to explain the need for innovative financing, how it fits into the education challenges that we all face, how the particular facility, the International Facility for Education, would work, and what it can achieve in the light of the circumstances just so eloquently described by Amina. Now, we know we have food crises, energy crises, debt crises, we have depreciating currencies, on top and layered on top of COVID, conflict, and of course, the existential problem of climate change. But I think we all agree, and a yesterday's session I know brought it out with young people, that education crisis is deep-seated, it is long-standing, it is persistent, and indeed, unless we take action, it will become endemic, threatening a whole generation of young people. And of course, it has been compounded in the last 2 years by the cuts that have had to be made in educational budgets in low-income and middle-income countries having to deal with the health and social safety net emergencies. And it is now being compounded, and I think this is indeed something we've got to recognize at this summit, by 43 bilateral aid donors cutting their commitments to education. And so we face also a crisis in the provision of international development aid, and we have to do something about it. Now, the result is that nearly 300 million children are not going to school, that 800 million children will leave education without any qualifications whatsoever. And while the World Bank used to tell us that we were betraying half our future, that only 50% were learning and were able to read and write at the age of 10 and 11. They now think the figure is between 60 and 70%. And certainly we used to say that 50% were leaving education without qualifications for the workplace. And now in Africa, in Asia and Middle East, that is a figure that has risen to 70%. So the crisis has to be dealt with, and it has to be dealt with in dramatic and in very, very big and radical ways. And that's why we are focusing on a new way of raising finance for education that offers us the opportunity to really considerably increase the resources over the next few years in a way that we unfortunately know that aid is not going to do on its own. And we're talking about two things. One is how we can increase the resources available to low-income countries, and that will be discussed this afternoon. And one of the proposals is to increase IDA, the International Development Association, and to give a bigger share of that to education. And that over time could raise $10 billion, and that would be for the 200 million children who are in low-income countries. But there are 700 million children in the middle-income countries that we are talking about. They are the biggest group of children out of school. They are the biggest group of refugees and displaced children who are in need of our help through Education Cannot Wait, UNICEF and other organizations. And it's how we can deal with the funding gap that exists when countries move from low-income countries to middle-income countries, that IFID, the International Finance Facility for Education, is supposed and is intended to deal with. For while 11% of the World Bank's low-income facility goes to education, only 6% of the middle-income facility is going to education, and it is very underfunded, and finance ministers are not using it to fund education in the way they should. So what we are proposing is the creation of a new facility, the International Facility for Education. And it's got three big advantages. One, it will provide more money. We are short of money, and it will provide more resources and substantially more resources. We look at loans and grants, but this is guarantees. And it's guarantees that can be given by donor countries without accounting against their balance sheet in the European Union area of countries. And therefore, it is money that cash-strapped countries who are not spending on aid can actually devote in guarantees. And that is additional money that is not taking money from anything else, additional money that can be found. The second thing and the advantage is it can be done at a lower rate of cost. And that means that we can offer money at far lower rates than either the IB/D of the World Bank or market rates. And these guarantees, backed up by a limited amount of capital, can mean that the charge that is made for receiving this money is incredibly low and can be at basically the same rates as IDA. And the third advantage of this is it is really cost effective, because while in the case of the MDBs, the World Bank and other regional development banks, The leverage rate for the capital they provide is about 5 to 1. The leverage here is 25 to 1. And so you are getting far more money into education for the resources that you are prepared and able to put up. So let me give an example. 2.5 billion in guarantees with $1 billion in grants can create 10 billion of extra resources. And that is a massive shift in the amounts of money that is available for education in the countries that we are talking about, who have, as I remind you, the biggest number of out-of-school children and where action is urgently needed. So why do we need it? It's clear that aid has fallen from 8.5% to 6.5% when it comes to education as a share of aid. Why do we need it? The average amount of aid, when you take the World Bank and all the bilaterals and multilaterals together, is only $15 per child in Africa, and that's barely enough to pay for a textbook. We've got to do better than that. And why do we need it? Because we know that in the next two or 3 years, if we're going to get anywhere towards the Sustainable Development Goal that every child should be at school by 2030 and learning effectively, then we need a facility like this. This is additional to everything we're doing, and it's something that can be done tomorrow if we make up our mind to do it. Now, Amina has rightly mentioned the need for reform, improvement of standards, the better use of money, the training of teachers, the infrastructure that's needed for education. But she has rightly reminded us that a lot of this cannot be done without the provision of extra finance. And so the new global compact that is proposed at this summit is, of course, increased domestic resource mobilization, particularly through ensuring that tax revenues come in, and we'll talk about that this afternoon. More money for the low-income countries through the expansion of the International Development Association, countries reminded of their responsibilities in this difficult world, that education unlocks all the other development goals, and so aid to education is important, but IFID is something that we can agree today should be one of the deliverables from the summit tomorrow. And I'm reminded of the voices of people yesterday, young people, who say to me, I don't want to be a child bride. I want to learn at school. I don't want to be forced into child labor. I want to learn at school. I don't want to be someone who is denied connectivity. Let me learn. I want to have an opportunity. I want to have a fair shot. I want to have the chance to realize my potential. I want to bridge the gap between who I am and what I can become. Let me learn. And I think the message that must go out from the summit today is that millions of young people around the world denied that chance are saying with one voice, let me learn. And we can deliver this through the innovative financing as a major part of the agenda of a reform of education that the Secretary of General has made possible with Amina by making this summit happen at this vital moment, halfway between 2015 and 2030, when we were to achieve the development goals. This is the vital moment. Let us use it. Let us create IFID while making all the other reforms that are being proposed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for these very strong introductory statements. Before I will turn to the panel, I would like to briefly put a visual on the screen that highlights how efficient IFED really is, because it is an instrument that has a particular advantage to some of the existing facilities out there. So to visualize this, we have this little figure that is really big on the screen here, so I hope you can see it. So in many countries, we could take, let's say, $140 million and simply give that out as grants. And that is necessary in some cases. Whether it's low-income countries or countries in emergencies, those grants may be necessary. But in the lower middle-income countries who have developed further and are able to take on other types of financing, there is an opportunity to use that $140 million and turn it into $1 billion. So you can immediately see, because of this combination of grants and guarantees, and we can talk about the specifics of this more for those who have an interest in this, you actually are creating this incredible leverage. So if you simply hand out grants, you can help a few children. If you hand it out, or if you create the International Finance Facility, you could help at least 7 times as many children and young people. So I hope you will keep this in your minds, because the financing gap is so large that we need innovations like this. We've worked very hard over a number of years to develop this instrument together with the multilateral development banks and international donors, as well as philanthropies. The instrument is ready to be launched. It has been assessed by the credit rating agencies, who have said it is very solid and has a high AAA rating. Now what we need is a group of public and philanthropic donors that can make this a reality. And that is what we are planning for to happen in September. And I'm therefore also very pleased to now play a message from one of the donors who have already made a strong commitment to IFED and have been champions for its undeniable innovation. We'd like to play a message from Vicky Ford, Minister for Africa at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom.
When it comes to financing education in developing countries, there is some good news. As incomes have grown, government expenditures on education have risen 6-fold, and ODA is now a much smaller proportion of education funding, just 2% in lower middle-income countries. However, global education systems are facing a perfect storm. Learning poverty has risen amid pandemic-related school closures. The number of school-aged children is rising, and domestic budgets, which have been the key driver of increased education spend, are constrained as countries deal with the fallout of the pandemic. It is clear there is an imperative to act to stop these learning losses costing this generation trillions in lifetime earnings. But what will be our response? ODA grants for education have stalled and are not going to shift the dial anywhere but the poorest countries. Education needs to start thinking outside the box in the way that the health and climate sectors have been doing for a long time. In our current economic climate, with household spendings on schooling squeezed by inflation and donor budgets stalling, it is only through innovative finance that we're going to be able to increase the volume of finance for education. The Transforming Education Summit and support of UN Secretary General provides a great plan for this relaunch. The focus on financing for education systems also puts IFED front and centre, and the case for investing in education is more compelling than ever. That's why the UK supports the development of IFED initiative and is now providing seed capital to support its launch at the Transforming Education Summit in September. This is not about aid diversion from low-income countries to lower middle-income countries. It's just repurposing some of the $7 billion of ODA that goes to lower middle-income countries each year to turn into more suitable loans. Even beyond the current post-pandemic crisis, more countries will continue to graduate to lower middle-income status, and unless we can incentivize them to borrow for education, we know what will happen. Education investments soon switch to infrastructure and other items with a quicker commercial return, leaving human capital behind them. So IFED is the best feasible option we have for increasing financing to education, for making donor investments go further, and for ensuring education ODA becomes more relevant in the coming years. So I want to encourage other donors, governments, the private sector, philanthropists to come on board and make this a reality.
Thank you very much. So now it's my great honor to introduce our panel. We have in the room here with us Minister Tariq Shawki, Minister of Education from Egypt. Mr. Minister, you are known to be a strong supporter for modernization of education, and you have developed several innovative initiatives in Egypt, such as the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, which has been an example for many. We also have Minister Usman Sharif Kadayev, First Deputy Minister of Public Education of Uzbekistan, who is helping to lead one of the three key ministries in charge of education in Uzbekistan. We also have in the room with us Judith Herbertson, Head of Girls Education at the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the United Kingdom. And Judith, apart from having or leading this incredible department, she has also a wealth of experience being in many countries around the world and working in the field on education. And then on the line, we have Woo Chong Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Reports directly to the ADB President and is responsible for supporting the bank-wide strategy on key initiatives and issues, and has been really a leader in helping to bring this innovation to reality. And then finally on the line also is Fabio Segura, co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation. Mr. Segura has been leading the foundation since 2019, but also has a lot of expertise in countries themselves. And we have, I know, also delegations here in the room, as well as ministers from other countries, Sri Lanka, representatives from Côte d'Ivoire, and so on. And we hope that we will bring you into this discussion later as well. So, but first of all, I would like to turn to you, Minister Shawki, because the Deputy Secretary General and Mr. Brown have both talked about the urgency of the current moment. You are pushing a very ambitious agenda in Egypt. How do you see the situation from your point of view, and what challenges are you facing in getting access to the necessary funding to support your ambitious agenda?
Well, good morning, everyone. It was very inspiring this morning to hear the comments by Ms. Amina and Mr. Brown, of course, and answering your question, Elizabeth, will take like 2 hours, but we reduced that to 5 minutes. I'll try to share with you the dream and the challenges at the same time. Now, Egypt has embarked on a very ambitious endeavor, which is to reimagine our education system, and that is easier said than done. And it's a 14, 15 years project, to say the least, and very costly. And we were hit by global challenges, like many other countries, like COVID-19 and current conflicts in the world and so on. But I have to say that in Egypt, the size of the problem, we have today over 25 million students, and our constitution has clauses that education is free for everyone, for all 25 million, from kindergarten to the end of college. So you have to really finance this particular promise. So we want to raise the quality, we want to create a very modern education system at a time when technology is all around us, and those are very expensive things to do, to hire and train teachers, to build more schools, to develop digital content, to do the networking infrastructure. It's a lot of cost. Not only that, but the bigger challenge is that our student population increases by 800,000 children every single year because of population growth. So mathematically speaking, this problem is is really increasing very fast, much faster than our ability to finance it. At the same time, our share in the federal budget, the education share relative to GDP, by constitution it should be 4%, but we are getting less than 2% in reality of the budget. And to make it really more precise, Lisbeth, our share of the budget per student is about $200. So imagine having such grand dreams, and yet you have in your hands like to spend only $200 per student, and that number decreases by the population growth. So every year I have to spend less on each student. Now, why the budget is decreasing? The political will is there, but there are competing priorities also on energy and on the COVID needs to buy vaccines and so on. So the budget is constrained. So this is a dilemma everywhere in the world. So if we look ahead, for us to continue the reform or the transformation we are having, we need to really think of the business model, and we need, this is a moment where we do need innovative financing models and think really out of the box, because if you do some extrapolation, and I'm sure this picture is repeated around the world, it is getting tougher, not easier, because of the increased numbers of kids and the more hopes we have for them. And as Mr. Gordon Brown said, yes, let me learn, let me have an opportunity and so on. So we believe in that, but to achieve that, we need to solve the financial problem by creative instruments like the IFFED. I think one idea I want to just leave on the table is to do funding in a very creative way. It used to be aimed at projects or aimed at countries. Now it should aim now at grand projects that can serve more than one country. I mean, countries have to share those resources. We don't all have to do everything. I think it's a time where we can think of regional funding, grant project funding, and save the money elsewhere. We have done that nationally. The Knowledge Bank you mentioned is a model of how to do purchasing in a very creative way to save money. Now, of course, we have done a lot in Egypt we can share with others, thus continue the project and save money for others. So the same 100 million could give you a bigger return if divided that way. We can share content, we can share platforms, we can share solutions. So this, I think, is very exciting, and it may help a lot.
That is wonderful. And thank you so much for mentioning that, because I know that under the Digital Learning Action Track, there are discussions, and I see Leonardo Garnier, the special envoy in the room here, about sort of both creating national knowledge platforms or digital platforms, but also thinking about a global platform and connecting these different platforms. And again, IFED could be an instrument that can support these efforts to get open access and resources to populations, whether that's teachers or students and so on. So now I would like to turn to Minister Usman from Uzbekistan. I would love to also hear from you, Mr. Minister, about the financing challenges that you face in education in Uzbekistan, but also if you could tell us a little bit what you think IFED could do for you if you had access to this additional finance. What kind of things would you do with this?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank all organizers of this event. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your questions. As His Excellency Amina Muhammad and His Excellency Gordon Brown, also our colleague from Egypt, mentioned, the process of education and the problems we see that it's not the case where the country is situated, how many the population of this country, but nearly all problems are the same. And everyone always knows that the education is an important element of the economy, and it will be and it can be the driver of the economy for every country. But unlike many other areas, it's impossible to quickly show the result and the effect of the allocated resources. And this is, I think, the main challenge for us, to explain the importance of expense for education and try to find additional findings. So that's why today's discussion and the main idea of the establishing this kind of fund is very important for us. Of course, each year, government of Uzbekistan allocate a large number of resources to education. Just example for the current year, for the school system portion in the budget is nearly 15% of total country budget. It's nearly $3 billion US, but we should understand that nearly 90% of that amount is the salary of the teachers. That's why always the additional money is very needed and important. We still have a lot to do, improve schools and kindergartens infrastructure, build newly, create new learning spaces for children, improve teachers' level, knowledge, skills, increase the quality of education. Also, I see our colleagues from the international banks online. I think this is the problem for all of the countries. I think it's the same issue. The level of interest rates, even from the development banks, sometimes a bit high. For example, countries think to take line for the schools construction. However, companies in our country work in a national currency, and they do not want to take risk with the foreign currency. Maybe during the establishing this kind of foundation, these issues also can be taken account. And answering the second part and the most interesting part of your question is that additional, as I said, money always important, and I think everyone can find where to spend them. I want to say that in our country, in Uzbekistan, we adopt strategies for development of preschool education, school and higher education. We have some kind of unique system when we have 3 ministries. In some case, someone think that it's too much, but it helps us to concentrate in a real problem. For example, the Minister of Preschool Education work with the kindergartens. School issues can take part separately. And each system has a strategic development goal for 2030, which is fully in line with the SDG goals. So I want to mention 2-3 main issues which can important for us, and the allocation of money to these goals would be very important in the coming 5 years, which belongs to the school system. The first is the infrastructure development. Currently, we need additional 1.2 million places for school children. Fortunately, the school system is compulsory and free in Uzbekistan, and 99% of total children attend and have access to the schools. But always establishing new schools and build new infrastructure is very important. Secondly, of course, is the teachers' quality. We are planning to implement a bonus system based on the knowledge and skills for the teachers. Just one example, 2 years ago, nearly 14 months ago, government established this system for the foreign language teachers, which means if you have an international level certification, teacher can get extra bonus for their salary up to the 50%. And just one number, when government announced this instrument, the level and the portion of the teachers with the international certification in English, French, and German was nearly 4%. Now it's, after 15 months, it reached almost 15%, we see that the teacher, when they see the opportunity to get better salary, they start to work on themselves. So we are planning to implement this kind of bonus system for other subjects and other teachers. But of course, it would be very hard. We need a new methodology. We need a new assessment system. That is another way. And the third, of course, is giving equal and inclusion access to everyone. Again, as I mentioned, 99% and even more boys and girls attend the schools. It's compulsory and free. But of course, there are some children from the poor families, children with disabilities, to whom we should look more carefully and help, even not to children, maybe to their families as well. And this is the main challenge for the near future. And I want to say that currently in our country, we are adding some new elements to the constitution of the country. And one of the new idea is write in the constitution not only that public education is free and compulsory, but also mention that the children with the disabilities will be provided by in the families will be provided by the country extra help. And finally, the last but not least is digitalization, as our colleague from Egypt mentioned. We heard that they have a huge good story in their country. Of course, real lessons at schools is definitely important. However, digital platforms and innovative solutions can centrally improve the quality of teaching and education and become a good instrument in delivering content. But I think there are two main issues which should always take in consideration during the digitalization. First is availability of access to internet, the availability of the electronic hardwares and gadgets at families, because parents and children have to use it at home. And the main thing is, of course, the skills to work on these gadgets and skills to work online with that resources. And the second part, we can design a good ecosystem, a good program, but without updated updated content, without updated lectures of the teachers, this program will be always only the program. The very important part is to always work on these issues and develop these resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These are some really concrete ideas where IFED could really make a great difference. And I would now like to turn to Woo Chong-um, who's the Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank. The International Finance Facility for Education has been developed together with the multilateral development banks. There was the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and we have a representative here from the IDB as well as the World Bank. It is taken forward now by the regional development banks, and in particular, the first bank who is signing on is the Asian Development Bank, and they will be followed quickly by the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. So what I would like to ask you, Woo Chong, is why did ADB get involved in this? The regional development banks and the ADB in particular are really positioning themselves at the front of innovation. But why are you actually doing this? How do you see IFED contributing over time to your work and mission? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join this. And just from my personal situation, I'm on leave and I just took my COVID booster shot and it's 3 in the morning. But I wanted to get up to join this because this is probably the most important thing for me personally and also for the Asian Development Bank to push forward. So as you know, we've been involved in this initiative since 2018 or so, and back then the IFID was something that we had to spell out. But now I got to tell you, in ADB, IFID is already a defined acronym in ADB, so I don't have to explain. When we first got involved in this, we had just set up our long-term strategy, Strategy 2030, and we had identified education along with health as one of the core pillars for ADB to take forward for the next 10 years. But we had faced, a very interesting challenge where education, everyone knows is important, and everyone talks about how important it is for long-term prosperity of countries, but it often gets squeezed down by the other demands like the infrastructure finance and climate change and others. So that's a bit of a problem. And the other issues, as one of the speakers mentioned, that some of the countries have particular problem. The lower middle income countries who are losing access to concessional financing. So it's making even harder to push the education agenda. But in the midst of that, our strategy 2030 set an ambitious goal of increasing our education investment from about 4% to 10% back in 2018. So this IFID program is a fantastic initiative which brings in the concessionality for the developing countries who need this money at the right rate. But one thing actually changed in the last 3 years. 2018, ADB had just merged our concessional and regular lending window, which tripled our base. So some people said, why we don't need a headroom, so why do we need this, right? But then back then, I really pushed and saying that yes, we don't need a headroom at the time, but we do need to look at longer term. It's not just 2018, but we have to look at long-term investment program because education takes years and years, and it's a decades and or even 100 years investment vision that we need to take forward. And doing this kind of innovative financing to leverage, let each dollar go 4 or 5 times is a great way to, first of all, pilot test this initiative, not just for education, but for many other sectors. Because as you mentioned, and as you know, at some point we have to do capital increase for MDBs, which is a very complicated process. And also the donors, you have to give the donors a break. We can't be just asking the same kind of donation in the same way we do, because there are a lot of competing demands. So fast forward 3 years, the situation is very, very, very different because we had, of course, the climate change is continuing to cause problems, but also the pandemic. And then, and pandemic has put a particular stress on education because the country that we sit in the Philippines, we haven't actually had a face-to-face education for the last 2 years. So people are falling behind. So we have to revamp that. And also the issue with the invasion of Ukraine and the food price and the energy price is more and more demands coming in for everywhere. So now it's even more urgent that we get this initiative up and running. And last point I want to make is that for the donors, this is the best deal you'll see in the market because for $140 million of paid in capital alongside a guarantee, we're going to generate $1 billion of investment. So we're saying test us out, and also it's basically riskless because ADB, AFDB, IDB, and we have a track record of over hundreds of years collectively that we can do this investment program well. So give us a chance to pilot this innovative program, and let's get the money to the country so that those girl childs, who actually want to learn to change their lives can get their wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Woo Chong. And again, thank you for getting up in the middle of the night. And you have done this consistently, which means that you really believe in this. And we are so grateful to you. I will now turn to Fabio Segura from the Jacobs Foundation. And what I wanted to highlight here is that IFED is not only a public instrument, it is also really trying to bring in philanthropic actors. And there are several reasons for that. Of course, philanthropists have resources that they can contribute, but they also are at the front of innovation. And we are at a time in history where we really need to do things differently. And so IFED will be an opportunity potentially for bringing this innovation into the multilateral development bank system and to countries by engaging with these actors as well. So I would like to ask Fabio how he is thinking about potentially joining IFED, and what is it that attracts you and your foundation to this instrument. And I should say, as I mentioned earlier, Fabio Segura had some wonderful work also in countries, and in particular, the Jacobs Foundation did some incredible work in Côte d'Ivoire. We have a representative here from Côte d'Ivoire, where they really demonstrated how the philanthropic sector and the multilateral development banks can work together. It wasn't easy, but they did it. And so, Fabio, it would be wonderful to hear from you why you want to be part of this, and how do you see this partnership working at country level?
Elizabeth, thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. My greetings to you all, Excellency Mohammed, Sir Gordon Brown, dear ministers, and members of the Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, as the head of the Jacobs Foundation, it is my responsibility to think about where our capital can be more relevant. And as we in foundations tend to do, we have traditionally prioritized the most urgent needs, the least advantaged. What has been said today already in the panel, and the situation we read about every day in the news, basically forces us to also think about what is relevant in the current context. And there are more children in need of quality education in other parts of the world than the low and least developed countries. So that's the first of the motivations that is driving us to look seriously about the IFED opportunity. We have to also see that the gap in the funding and the solution that IFED proposes is placing the important at the same level of the urgent. And that's something that we cannot lose sight of as an international community. The second reason we're seriously considering this engagement is that of scale. Foundations tend to do projects and pilots and leave the scaling up to others. And I think it is time for foundations, for philanthropy, and for the private sector to engage themselves in a serious theory of scale that actually is coordinated from the onset and not ex post, not once we have a proven concept. It is, let us adapt, let us think about the evolving and changing context we're in and plan for and design for scale from the onset. So this particular initiative merges the financing at scale with the transformation of policy, as well as the innovative testing of solutions and models that could actually bring about better education from the onset. And that design is incredibly attractive to us and should be to foundations around the world looking into the scaling bits of their projects. And the third one is the opportunity that IFED brings in terms of doing things differently. It has been stated over and over that we are perhaps witnessing the largest and deepest crisis of education in the history of education worldwide. And what has been less stated is that this is also perhaps the largest and deepest transformation the education system globally has undergone. We are more aware about the need for quality education than we have been before. Stakeholders, teachers, parents, students themselves perhaps value more than ever what we have taken for granted for so many years and are readier for change. And we have really an opportunity, and this is something that IFED plays a critical role in by involving different stakeholders to bring about better evidence about what works and use that evidence in policymaking and use that evidence in programmatic implementation. We have more than ever the opportunity to bring different stakeholders, private sector, policymakers, even companies and corporates, and think together about the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity we have to bring about better future for those who are in need. And this multi-stakeholder coalition that IFED is proposing is an incredible opportunity we have to harness and see how we can bring about not only capital, but different ways of doing things and different thoughts and different approaches to solving this major opportunity and challenge that we have as an international community. So thank you very much for that. And I look forward to following up very closely on the development of IFED.
Thank you so much, Fabio. And I have learned very much from the work that you have done in countries as well, and how you are trying to do this new way of multi-stakeholder partnerships, which is really the way to go moving forward. Last but not least, I would like to turn to Judith Herbertson. We are bringing it back to the United Kingdom, who have been supporters of IFED from the very beginning. There are other countries also really signing on. We have Sweden very close to considering and contributing, committing to this. We had a pledge from the Netherlands in 2019 as well, and we are continuing to reach out to both bilateral as well as philanthropic donors. We have support from already 2 foundations as well. So we really need to bring this coalition together to do 2 things. It is to provide the guarantees, but also to provide the grant financing. And I would like to ask you, Judith, why it is so important that you are also committing to both windows. So we have the guarantee window and the grant window. What attracts your government in doing this, and why you think it is necessary for education to have these 2 windows and instruments working side by side?
Thank you very much, Lisbeth, and good morning to everybody online and in the room. It's been a good news story over the last few years that ODA's diminishing importance in developing country education systems has been part of the narrative. We know that governments are responsible for delivering their own education, and they need to be in the lead. But as incomes have grown, government expenditures on education have risen 6-fold, and therefore ODA is now a much smaller proportion, just around 2% in lower middle income countries. But now, of course, we've got global education systems facing a perfect storm, as we've been hearing: post-COVID recovery, rising school numbers, an uncertain economic outlook, which will make the next few years very, very difficult for education systems. So as donors and as philanthropists, as the private sector and as governments themselves, we're all asking the question, what do we do about it? And I think as donors, we need to be extremely honest with ourselves and recognise that our contributions to education have been stagnant for quite some time. In 2010, DAC countries gave around $9.3 billion to education. In 2020, exactly the same number. And with the current fiscal pressures, I'm sorry to say it's unlikely that we will see much change in the next year or 2. We just don't know. And as Gordon Brown reminded us, 43 donors have made cuts to their ODA contributions to the education system. And yet we know, every single one of us in the room has travelled to Paris because we know there's a crisis in education. But you can't solve a crisis without money. So IFED is a financing solution which creates both new and additional financing within existing budget envelopes, allowing donors, cliché maybe, to do more with less. Because donors only need to contribute 15% of their guarantee contributions to IFED, and then IFED is able to multiply them 4-fold on capital markets and thereby unlock even more capital. A very reassuring message there from the Asian Development Bank about the potential of this level of funding, the level of risk, and the return on the investment that we can all make. If it is not just about creating more money, though, it's about making that financing affordable and accessible to countries, and this is where the grants come in. Many lower middle income countries can afford to borrow for education, but not at commercial rates. And when countries graduate from concessional lending, as more and more countries will continue to do, notwithstanding the potential global economic crisis we're facing, then we see them move away from human development, with lending falling around 60% on average. They will prioritise other areas, and borrowing for education, for some reason, because it's a long-term investment on long-term returns, doesn't always get the priority it should. And so these grants, which are part of the IFED model, should then help to support countries, incentivise countries to invest in education. I have to say, outside this session, we're hearing lots of ambition and enthusiasm to tackle the education crisis, to change lives. And yesterday I talked in a couple of sessions about keeping a focus on that girl. In other words, the girl who symbolises the crisis, poor, living in a rural area, living in a refugee camp, maybe disabled, maybe malnourished following the pandemic, with absolutely no hope for unlocking her own future, really the hardest to reach. And if we can help her to achieve basic skills, open the doors to another 12 years or more of quality education, and really change her life, then we'll know we can live up to our aspirations. And then we have to do it for all boys and all girls in the world. And those are the numbers Gordon Brown was talking about. But the people in this room were being slightly more hard-nosed and perhaps clear-eyed about the funding gap that faces us, and thinking we can be as enthusiastic and ambitious as we want for that girl, unless we have the funding. And as somebody kindly said, you can't keep asking donors for funding they just don't have. Then it will be pie in the sky, and we'll look back and think, why did we not take that risk and work with an innovative financing mechanism that has the potential to unlock at least a good chunk of the money that we need in these countries. And right now, this year, ahead of the tests, IFED is the best feasible option we have for increasing finance to education, for making donor investments go further, and for assuring that education ODA becomes more relevant in the coming years. And this is really why I'd like to encourage donors, as well as governments, and that doesn't just mean, forgive me, ministers of education, of course. We have had to work with our Treasury. It means ministers of finance, it means head of state, to give the political and the financial commitment to work in this way, the private sector, the philanthropists, to work through the numbers and commit to channel financing this way, really to supercharge the education financing that we know we're going to need from what we're saying in the other rooms, and bridge that chronic financing gap. Thank you, Lisbeth.
Thank you so much. And I think you make a very good point about the gap is urgent and we need to fill it now. The Deputy Secretary General has sometimes talked about, let's not provide medicine after death, because we have all these ideas about the future and there may be finance coming into the future, but we need this finance right now. And that is why actually using a borrowing instrument is really what is needed to fill the gap, in addition, as many of us have said, to, of course, increasing these domestic revenues as well. So I would like to now turn it to some of the people in the audience. We have some wonderful participants also sitting in the room. And I know we have the minister here from Sri Lanka. Mr. Minister, I would love to call on you briefly, and then obviously others who would like to come in as well. We will spend about 15 minutes to turn this over to the audience. Thank you, Minister.
So thank you, Ms. Lisbeth Steer, Executive Director, for giving me the opportunity to express my views regarding the two introductory statements made by Ms. Amina Mohammed DSG and Mr. Gordon Brown, UN Special Envoy. And then in those introductory statements, it's referred to Asian Development Bank funding, the innovative financing education budget, and 800 plus children leaving education due to the effects of COVID-19 pandemic. So it's timely design financing project called IFED, which will be launched in mid-September 2022 in New York. It's good news for us, especially to support LMICs. The innovative finance to unlock critical education investments, it itself says investment. It's not just funding. It's an investment, especially in the low-income, low-middle-income countries affected by COVID-19. Now, Sri Lanka, with 22 million population and 4.1 student population, we have over 10,000 public schools, private schools, and international schools. The birth rate is somewhere around 1% every year. There are 350,000 newborn infants. So adding to student population, so you can't stop it. It's like flowing, right? Then our literacy rate somewhere around 94%, and the IT literacy is 51% at the moment. So no gender inequality in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, the girls are doing better than boys in the field of education. So we are targeting to achieve the targets set by SDG goal number 4, the quality education. Now, as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, the year 2020 and 2021, we lost more than 50% of school days, the school hours. But despite all these challenges, we managed to hold all public examinations with 2 to 3 months delay. But we are in the process of regularizing the school system with all these challenges. Now, I like to focus attention to the budgets. So in Sri Lanka, the 85% of the education budget we have to allocate for recurrent expenditure, the paying teacher salaries, allowances, and all that. So we are remaining with just 15% to improve infrastructure facilities. Now we must have some innovative thinking to continue the same standard of education in our country. So we have already discussed and planned to introduce 20 channels. One of the private companies willing to give us 20 channels in education, covering 1 to 13, both in Sinhala and in Tamil and English. So over 7,500 contents have been done at the moment from grade 1 to 13. So we are ready with contents. So we need to provide televisions and the modem to each and every school like that. Of course, I just want to conclude my just intervention. The challenges support financial support, the technical support for certain teacher development, the content development, and education reforms. Yeah. These are in the agenda. So in order to do that and to maintain the present standard and improve it further, so we need financial support. So I welcome the idea of FED, which will be launched in September. So I invite all the contributors, Asian Development Bank, other financial organizations, and individuals and other organizations to contribute. It's an investment in education.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we are really grateful to hear your voice as well. I think sometimes when we go and speak to donors, they ask us, but we'd like to hear from the countries. So I think this is a very loud and clear message from the countries that this is a necessary instrument. And I would like to turn to the people who would ultimately benefit from this, because we talk about donors, we talk about governments, but at the end of the day, it's about young people. It's about those people that Mr. Gordon Brown was talking about, the people who want to learn. So I would like to turn to Sarah, the Global Youth Ambassador, to make a brief intervention to tell us why we need IFED. Why do we need to act as an international community?
Thank you very much. So, as you already mentioned, the number of children that are out of school is increasing at an alarming rate. And if you look at funds like Global Partnership for Education and Education Cannot Wait, they are doing critical work to combat this. But there are many challenges, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you add the fact that education funding was recently cut in 2/3 of the poorest countries in the world, like, we have a serious issue, and young people are calling for action, and they're calling for action now. So what I'm asking is, how will this fund deliver change quickly, and can it reasonably get us back on track for 2030? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a very good call on everybody to make that happen. I have someone in the audience as well. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Neema Lugangira. I'm a member of parliament in Tanzania, and I'm very pleased to be here. My interest was, when we're talking about this financing, is it just going to focus on the infrastructure, let's say the buildings, the classrooms, desks, etc., or will there also be considerations of things that are often forgotten? For example, school nutrition. A lot of schools in developing countries do not yet have school feeding programs. Are we also going to consider things like access of sanitary pads to girls? Because a lot of girls from rural communities miss a lot of school days every month when they're in their menstrual cycle because they cannot afford sanitary pads. And also, I just wanted to understand this movement, what is the linkage with involving parliamentarians? Because I'm a member of parliament in a developing country, Tanzania, and I would imagine such decisions, you know, parliamentarians also have a role in it. But at what point are we going to ensure that we capacitate parliamentarians to be able to advise their governments correctly, but also provide that oversight in making sure whatever funds that are brought in are actually used and put to use accordingly? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And those are two excellent questions. And on the second question, we will come back to you, how we involve the parliamentarians. We would love your support. I'll just quickly answer on your question with regards to, does IFED support school feeding or any other kind of issues that seem to be outside, the sort of inside-outside. IFED was designed in such a way that it will support anything that supports learning outcomes. And that was very deliberate, because we do not want to be restricted by just what is defined education. We have to invest in the whole child and in the needs of the whole child in order to learn. So there are, in the framing documents, there are sentences that are allowing for those extra investments that are necessary in many situations. And maybe when we come back to the panel, some of our panelists could speak to that too. Go ahead in the audience. Maybe we take another couple of questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Anna Hipondoka. I'm the Minister of Education in Namibia. I'm so much interested in the IFED funding, but I need to understand one aspect that is always affects our country with regard to donor funding. It's the issue of classification as upper middle income, which for us, we consider it to be a wrong. It is, when the World Bank did this classification, definitely with our skewed income, you know, it ended up classifying Namibia as an upper middle income. But if you look at the inequalities and the inequitable distribution of resources which we are struggling with up to now, this is really preventing us from getting funding from whatever donor arrangements are, if they continue to look at the classification as part of a determinant criteria. I need to understand, how does classification affect us? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll take one more question and then we can turn it back. Yes, go ahead. I think
my name is Sonny Echono. I represent the Tertiary Education Trust Fund from Nigeria. I want to greet everyone, including those joining virtually. I consider it important to weigh in on the context of this relative to Nigeria, given the peculiar challenges we have. We are 200 million population, 65% of that are below the age of 30, one of the highest population growth rates in the world, and currently facing huge revenue challenges, as well as multiple competing needs in the area of security, in healthcare, in infrastructure deficits, and so on. So it's very difficult to make a case for education financing or funding within that context. Under our policy, education at the basic level for the first 9 years is free and compulsory and is shared between the 3 layers of government. At post-secondary and tertiary levels, there are special funding mechanisms and the more expansive and inclusive participation matrix that covers both the private sector, faith-based organizations, individuals, and all the other players in the education field. IFED offers a unique opportunity for us to mobilize additional resources to focus on some key areas of transformation and modernization that we will require, especially in the skills and technical fields, for example, where we feel there's a whole low-hanging fruit of being able to mobilize and address our unemployment challenges by giving youth the necessary skills to fill gaps in the economy as well as make things for themselves. We also feel that the improvements we require by leveraging on ICT and technology to modernize our education will require substantial funding beyond the current arrangements that we have. But I believe the greatest opportunity that IFED offers is not even in the volume of funding, it being long-term and concessionary in terms of interest rates, but the efficiencies and accountability that it will bring and to enable us to focus more on results. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And that is a really good point also. And I want to emphasize again that there was a lot of work that has taken place, and the issue that you are pointing out with regards to the need to be focused on result is embedded in the instrument, and it will also incentivize everybody who's part of this, whether it's the philanthropists or the MDBs or the countries themselves, to really focus on this. In addition to also this issue of domestic mobilization of revenues, obviously the multilateral development banks already work with many countries on domestic resource mobilization, and so bringing IFED and through the MDBs is another way of really working on that side of the equation as well. I would finally like to just briefly answer the question that was asked about the upper middle income countries. And thank you for asking this question. You are not the only one who has raised this question. When we started designing IFED, there was a real belief that the missing middle was happening in the lower middle income countries. So the initial focus has been very much on this bracket of countries. Most of the lower middle income countries are now situated in Asia. In 5 to 10 years, a lot of them will be in Africa. In Latin America, we have the opposite problem. We have a lot of countries are emerging out of lower middle into upper middle, and obviously Namibia is one example in Africa. And we have had long conversations with our colleagues of the Inter-American Development Bank who have raised this issue and have said there are a lot of countries in Latin America that would like to have access to IFED. Maybe there are special circumstances, there could be climactic impacts, there could be crises that could be covered. So at the moment, upper middle income countries are not part of IFED, but IFED is going to be an instrument that's owned by its contributors and the people who are part of it, who benefit from it. So we very strongly urge you to raise this question, to engage with IFED, to engage with the donors who are providing funding to IFED, because it is something that will potentially adjust over time, and especially when we speak to our colleagues of the Inter-American Development Bank, they are fighting the fight in terms of the kind of upper limit. So I would like to close this panel by going back to our wonderful panelists and ask them in a very short, brief sentence or one word to tell us what you would like us to take away from this session in terms of why people should invest in IFED or what it means to you. So if you, Mr. Shauki, I would like to say, if you want to have a brief word to close, so we can all go on to the rest of the day.
Well, if I have to choose something to take away from this, I think it's absolutely imperative to think of out-of-the-box innovative financing models if we were to guarantee high-quality opportunities for learning for future generations.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Minister Usman?
Well, I would like to address to main donors and development banks not to be afraid and support the new initiatives on innovative financing, because all of this fund and work will affect to our young generation. For example, in Uzbekistan, it is more than 60% of total population is the youngsters until the 35 years old. All of them right now need a quality education, and their children will need it in a 10, 20, 30 years time. That's why I would like these main donors and development banks not to forget this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Judith, go ahead, since you are sitting here, and then I'll turn to the screen again.
Thank you. I'm going to go back and say we need to keep our eyes and heart focused on that girl and all your own versions of that girl. They exist in the UK as well, but keep our heads focused on the funding gap, the numbers, and how we bring in the resources that she needs and all the other boys and girls that she represents. And I think IFED can do that.
Thank you. Woo Chong, can we bring you back in? Are you still awake?
Yes. Yes, I'm very much awake. Yeah, so my takeaway for everybody is, particularly for the donor community, as you know, multilateral development banks have many shareholders and many policies and procedures. So when we do something new, it becomes a bit riskier, right? And there's reluctance. But this one, I cannot see anything that's really risky other than the fact this is innovative. So please give us a chance to demonstrate this and move this needle as quickly as possible, because we are running out of time.
Yes,
thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Woo Chong. Fabio?
I will just point out that in times of turbulence and crisis, it is not the crisis itself that poses the biggest danger and risk, be it the pandemic, the war, climate change. It is rather our belief and hope that we are going back to normal, that we're going to go back to something that existed before that. And that logic basically is perfectly prepared for a world that no longer exists. In times of crisis and turbulence, precisely we have to be brave enough to act differently and create new structures, new ways of working together, and new things that we're willing to do as a community.
Thank you, Fabio. And with that, I will turn appropriately back to Mr. Gordon Brown, the leader, our supporter, our encourager. Thank you so much, Gordon, for keeping going with this and being in front of this and pushing us all to keep moving on IFED. Please, if you would like to make some concluding remarks.
We've heard such moving, powerful, passionate, eloquent speeches in favor of the change that we need, and particularly from all the panelists and all those who've spoken from the floor, and you yourself, Lisbeth. And I think what we've found today is that this change is urgent, it is possible, it is deliverable in September. It can make a huge difference to millions of children around the world who say, let me learn. But I think the important follow-through from this is every country represented here who supports doing this, every foundation represented here who is in support, every donor country who's here in support, they know now that we have countries prepared to finance. They know now that we've got countries, a bank that is prepared to deliver as the first bank to do so. What we need is all those people who are supportive here to make their voice clearly heard in the most powerful way that this has got to happen in September. And if we do so, I believe it will. And just as Fabio said, we have got to give people hope. And hope is that every child has the chance at some time soon to realize their potential, even if they're out of school at the moment. We can make that happen. So thank you for your participation today.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Let's work together to make this happen and to let every child and young person in the world learn. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for coming.